Hello again. This time for this video, I want to talk about Araby by James Joyce, and we should just get right into it. So obviously, this is the first story that we're talking about. We also have a discussion. We're talking about Evelyn, so we've now read those two, and then we also have this week Dreams by Olive Schreiner, and then The Stranger for Catherine Mansfield. So these are now four stories that are possibilities for this essay, where you can pick one or two of them to write about. We're going to have, I think, one more, one more. I think next week. Yeah, and then that'll be the end of the stories, and those will be the ones that we have to choose from, and then we'll be focusing more on the actual writing of the essays. All right, but let's get into some analysis here. So I want to start first of all just talking about short stories. So I think this out of the stuff we're going to do in this class, short stories, poems, and plays. I think it's the short stories probably what we're the most comfortable with. We probably have the most experience reading like novels and stuff like that. And obviously, this is the same kind of paragraphs, narration, stuff like that. So I just want to point out some kind of stylistic things that we see here. And I'll bring this up again, and I'll kind of compare the Joyce to the other authors, because I think the two Joyce stories kind of have a similar, this Araby and Evelyn have kind of a similar style to them. But I just kind of want to read the first page here and just kind of take a look at the importance of like word choice and setting, and how short stories can create a kind of atmosphere or a kind of mood that can then color the way that we perceive the events that are happening here. How like with descriptions, the author paints a kind of backdrop where the action of the story takes place. So I just want to read the first page here of Araby and see what we can find out from it. So I want you to pay attention to like what kind of vibe do you get from it. Like you might have seen on like I know multiple choice kind of standardized tests, they talk about like mood and tone when it comes to literature. Maybe the better way of understanding it is like a vibe. I think that might make more sense for us. So what I would ask you to think about while I'm reading this is like what kind of vibe do you get from it, and which words in particular give you that feeling. All right, here we go. North Richmond Street, being blind, was a quiet street except at the hour when the Christian Brothers School set the boys free. An uninhabited house of 2 stories stood at the blind end, detached from its neighbors in a square ground. The other houses of the street, conscious of decent lives within them, gazed at one another with brown, imperturbable faces. The former tenant of our house, a priest, had died in the back drawing room. Air, musty from having been long enclosed, hung in all the rooms, and the waste room behind the kitchen was littered with old, useless papers. Among these I found a few paper-covered books, the pages of which were curled and damp, and he gives the names of some books. I liked the last best because its leaves were yellow. The wild garden behind the house contained a central apple tree and a few straggling bushes, under one of which I found the late tenant's rusty bicycle pump. He had been a very charitable priest. In his will, he left all his money to the institutions and the furniture of his house to his sister. When the short days of winter came, dusk fell before we had well eaten our dinners. When we met in the street, the houses had grown somber. The space of sky above us was the color of ever-changing violet, and toward it the lamps of the street lifted their feeble lanterns. Okay, so what sort of vibe do we get from this? What kind of impression is made on us just by these descriptions, right? Nothing's actually really happened yet. This is all just description of the setting, basically. But what I want us to see is kind of how things like that, like setting, contribute to the overall like message sometimes, but like feeling definitely of a short story. So I think the vibe that we get from this is definitely kind of a dark one, definitely not a good vibe, Maybe that's the first question: is it a good or bad kind of vibe? Probably more negative, right? Kind of dark, kind of gloomy, somber. I think they use some of those words. And some of the things that lead me to this: number one, the former tenant of our house, a priest, had died. So we've got a dead priest right there, right? Another thing that sticks out to me: I found the late tenant's rusty bicycle pump. It's a nice phrase, rusty bicycle pump. That's what to say. But besides being fun to say, I think, that's kind of a dark image of rusty. Like anything rusty means that it hasn't been cared for, it's been left out, it's gone bad, right? You have a bunch of the kitchen floor littered with old useless papers. You have the streets lifted their feeble lanterns. So I think we can see from like the word choice here how it creates like a mood, right? A vibe. All right, I just wanted to look at that really quick because that's something that we'll see in all short stories. And when we look at some of the other ones by some other authors, we'll see kind of the differences with this like stylistic stuff and how that contributes to like the larger meaning of the story. All right, but let's get into what actually happens here. So obviously, we get a description of Magnan's sister, right? Who a lot of this has to do with the boy and kind of his affection for Magnan's sister. And I got some interesting responses from people about whether they thought he was obsessive or whether we thought he was creepy or not. So I'll get into those. I think there were some good responses kind of on both sides of that. Excuse me. Um, so maybe I should just read this part. This is probably this is something that almost everyone mentioned because I think it does stick out as being kind of weird, maybe obsessive, something like that. But this is on page 40, where it says, "Every morning I lay on the floor in the front parlor watching her door. The blind was pulled down to within an inch of the sash, so I could not be seen. When she came out on the doorstep, my heart leapt. I ran to the hall, seized my books, and followed her. I kept her brown figure always in my eye, and when we came to the point which our ways diverged, I quickened my pace and passed her. This happened morning after morning. I had never spoken to her." I believe there is something about that kind of like sequencing of like, I did this every morning. I had never spoken to her. Like putting those two things together does lead me more towards like this is kind of strange behavior part of this. And then yeah, and her name was like a summons to all my foolish blood, right? But he doesn't really even know her. So I got some interesting responses here. Let me actually see really quick. So on one side here, I like this comment from Daniel. He says, "The boy often obsesses over Magnan's sister, which is shown when he continuously thinks about her and how it is negatively impacting his life." I think that's a good point. That about it negatively impacting his life. Other people mention this too about how he can't do his schoolwork and he can't focus and he doesn't listen to the teacher and he's not getting anything done and it's like taking over his entire life, right? Because I think if I remember back to when I've taken like psychology classes, a lot of the things that we talk about, about like is a certain behavior normal or is it a disorder? And I think what a lot of psychologists end up saying is like if it interferes with your life, it can get to the point of being a disorder. If it negatively impacts other parts of your life, then it becomes a problem. Because it's like think about like with OCD or something. If you have to wash your hands twice before you leave, is that a problem? Well, if it doesn't really affect your life, I mean, maybe not. But if you get fired from work because you're late because you're washing your hands all the time, then that's a problem, right? So I like that the way that Daniel put that, the way it's negatively impacting his life, the kind of like it's a little obsessive, right? Just like the constant thinking about it, right? But I think another good point was made. Let me see. I think Miguel said this. He said, but I don't think admiring someone for their physical appearance is creepy, and I think he did have a huge crush on her. So I think that is a good point too, right? That like I don't want to suggest that to think someone is attractive is to like do sexism, or like to be sexist. That's not true. That's just not true, right? That would just be denying. I think maybe Miguel or maybe someone else pointed out that that's just denying like a natural thing about being human. So I think maybe we can find some kind of space in between there where like it's okay if he is attracted to her appearance or whatever, but that maybe the level he takes it to, or maybe when it starts affecting his schoolwork and stuff, then like maybe that is kind of where it becomes like obsessive in a way. I thought there was another interesting question, and I know I put this word out there, so maybe it's my fault. But I think there's a similar kind of dynamic going on with the question of like, is it objectifying, right? Because like yeah, like I didn't mean to suggest that if you're just admiring that someone's beautiful or whatever or even for a guy if you're admiring that a guy is attractive or whatever, that is like objectifying them. Like I don't maybe it could be if it goes further, but I think it has to be more than that, right? Yeah, I take that point good from Miguel that like just admiring someone's appearance isn't like creepy in and of itself or something, right? And I think some other people actually provided a better way of thinking about this objectification question. Because I think there is something objectifying about it, and that's why I brought it up. Because obviously, him not really knowing her, or never having spoken to her, even right. I think that's part of it. Um, but someone else put it really well. This was Jonga. I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing that, but Jonga. They said this. I thought this was great. This was excellent, maybe even better than I would have said it. They said, I do not agree that he only treats her as an object of sexual desire without regard to her dignity. Instead, he admires her as if she is a god. The boy idealizes Magnan's sister in the same way that people of the Christian faith worship their god. And I think that was a really good way of putting this, right? Because it is a kind of objectification, and there's a few lines where he focuses on, her dress or her hair or her wrist and stuff like that. But I think even more than that, the way that he treats her like not a human is by treating her more like a god. I think that's really well said. And there are a couple of lines, at least two, I think I noticed when I was just reading this, where he talks about her being defined by light or like bright white light like shining like behind her. There's one when at the very beginning, I think she's like out at the front door or something, and he talks about her being defined by light. And then later on, when he talks to her about the bazaar, I think he talks about the bright light like on her neck or something. So I think there is some imagery there that is kind of like angelic in a way, And I think maybe that's what I was getting at when I said objectifying, because it's not the way we usually use that term, right? That term is usually used, whatever, to only care about appearance or just like to over sexualize, right? To like only, yeah, the guys only want one thing, like that kind of way of thinking about it, right? But I think this is a much better way of putting it, that he treats her as if she's a god. And I think that's what I was trying to get at with the other part where I asked about him putting her on a pedestal or treating her like she's perfect. So I thought that spoke to that really well. So like, yeah, when we're thinking about like, is he overly obsessive? Is he objectifying her? I think these are the good terms. I think you guys kind of represented both sides. Maybe we could find some kind of like middle ground on that part. And just one more thing on that. I also just saw this line that's really good from Daniel saying that the boy starts to deify Magnan's sister. And I thought that was really good. Deify. As like the specific kind of objectification that he's doing to her, where he treats her like, she's an angel or something. All right. I think the other big thing that I want to focus on with this story, another big component of it, and some of you definitely use this language, but I think it's the divide between the ideal and the real, or like fantasy and reality. And some of you definitely looked at this. I forget, somebody was talking about how unrealistic the boy is being. Like that like the problem with the way that he treats her is that it's just not realistic. Or that his expectations are too high. Oh yes, Amberly said here, the boy soon came to a realization that nothing is really perfect. He didn't purchase anything because his expectations were immediately dropped. So I think that's another way that I want to frame this is like the ideal versus the real. So I think obviously this works when we think about his connection to the girl, right? He has this idealized version of her. Maybe that's better than objectified. Is that it's an idealized version of her, or like we said, he treats her like a god or whatever, right? And this gets me. So what's the real version of this? This gets me to the ending of the story. Another way this is done. So I want to look at this in terms of the girl and his like love or whatever for her. And I also want to look at this in terms of Araby, which is the title of the story, right? So we should maybe talk about that a little bit, about the bazaar itself. Because I think before he goes to the bazaar, it also gets built up as this kind of like idealized thing. He talks about it, that it casts an Eastern enchantment. Enchantment, I think, is an interesting word there. I think that enchantment related to like ideal, related to fantasy. And he also, I think at one point refers to Araby as a magical name. So there's something fantastical and ideal about the bazaar as well. So let's take the bazaar first. So that's how he pictures it, right? In the couple of days after he talks to the girl, he can't focus in school, and he's just thinking about like how magnificent and I think like the Eastern part's significant too. I think there was a weird like I don't want to say racist, but like a strange kind of thing where people viewed like the East as like exotic and stuff like that. So I think there's some of that going on. So yeah, so he builds up Araby to be like this like magical thing, right? And then he gets there, and what's it like? Well, actually, before he gets there, he can't even get out the door, right? because his uncle is very late. And then when his uncle does come in, it talks about, that when he comes in the door, he's talking to himself, and he almost like he knocks over, or it says, I heard him talking to himself and heard the hall stand rocking when it received the weight of his overcoat. I could interpret these signs. What I think he's talking about here is I think the uncle is drunk. I think that's what it is. The uncle's talking to himself. The hall stand rocks. That must be because he threw the coat on it in a way that like he didn't place it gently, right? And then the uncle is like, he forgot about the giving the kid the money, and then he starts like reciting poetry, and the kid's like, "Can you just give me the money? I want to leave." So I think the uncle's drunk. Someone mentioned like what happened to the kid's parents. We don't know. So he already lives with them. We already have this, like I said at the beginning, this kind of like seedy, gloomy kind of backdrop to the whole story. So then he finally gets the money, and what happens? So he's got the money. He's going to the train. He says on page 44, I took my seat in a third-class carriage of a deserted train. After an intolerable delay, the train moved out of the station. So that's the first step of this, right? He gets to the train and an intolerable delay. And this reminds me of, like being in the city, like, if you've ever had to wait for, I don't know, the G train out in Brooklyn, like past midnight, and you're just there for like 40 minutes, and you're like wasted, like the train's just not coming. So he's just waiting for the train. It's deserted. He's the only one there. When he gets there, he says, in a few minutes, the train drew up beside an improvised wooden platform. So what? There's just like a piece of plywood, basically, taking people off the train. Not exactly fancy or magical. And then, of course, he gets. Oh, and then I like this part. He says, I could not find any sixpenny entrance, and fearing that the bazaar would close, I passed in quickly through a turnstile, handing a shilling to the weary-looking man. So he's mentioning the specific money that they're using there, but basically he was looking for a cheaper entrance and then couldn't find one, so had to take the more expensive one. So he has to pay more money than he wanted to get in. And then when he does get in, nearly all the stalls were closed, and the greater part of the hall was in darkness. So the place is like already closed down, right? He got there late because of his drunk uncle. And the story does take place in Dublin, Ireland, right? So alcoholism does have like a specific thing in Joyce's writing, and we see it in Evelyn as well. There's another drunk father, well, uncle here, father in Evelyn. But we see alcoholism kind of showing up as well, and it's just kind of like the seediness of reality like seeping into the perfection of the ideals that he has, right? So he has the vision of Araby as magical Eastern enchantment, and he gets there and it's closed, and and it's too expensive, and it takes forever to get there, and everything like that. And then one more thing I want to look at here. So I think one person actually kind of picked up on this. So that's how this works with Araby, right? In terms of ideal and real. He has the ideal of it, and then he sees the real of it, and it's this kind of disappointment, or maybe to use some other words like demystification, or disenchantment, or loss of faith. I think loss of faith is a kind of way of thinking about this story. Having faith in the ideal, and that the story kind of takes us through the process of losing that faith, right? So that's kind of how it works with the bazaar itself. So now let's return to Magnan's sister, to the girl. We talked about the kind of deification of her that happens in the beginning of the story. And then basically what I'm trying to do, so we have her being on a pedestal, idealized and all that, and then at the end, we get this last sentence where, gazing up into the darkness, I saw myself as a creature driven and derided by vanity, my eyes burned with anger, anguish and anger. And he doesn't buy anything. So basically, what I'm trying to do, I want to make a connection between, like, the vision of the girl as this, perfect angel, to him getting here where he sees himself a creature driven and derided by vanity. What happens? What brings about this realization? Because I think it's a similar thing, like I said, of like losing faith in the ideal and trying to come to terms with the real, right? But what brings him here? I saw one person. Let me see. I want to give them credit because this is kind of tough. It took me a long time to kind of make this connection. This was Elizabeth, who said the boy didn't buy anything for Magnan's sister. By seeing the girl flirt with the two boys in the hall, he realized that his feelings for Magnan's sister were incorrect. So I'd love to hear a little bit more about what you thought there. But that's kind of my reading of what happens here. So on page 45, the second to last one, He's at the stall, right? At this point, he could still buy something. He's at the bazaar. Some places are open. Even if he bought her, a stupid gift or it wasn't the best gift he wanted, it's still something, right? And then we get this. It says, at the door of the stall, a young lady was talking and laughing with two young gentlemen. I remarked their English accents and listened vaguely to their conversation. I want to pause here. It's significant that he says English accents because they're in Ireland, right? They're in Dublin. There's definitely a difference between Irish and English accents. So it's actually saying English accent here. The kind of history of this, for when this story is written in 1912 or whatever it is, at that time, Ireland is a colony of England, right? All of Ireland was a colony of England. Nowadays, Ireland is its own country, but there's still North Ireland, if you know anything about this, which is still part of Great Britain, right? It used to be all of Ireland was, and then there was a series of civil wars throughout the 20th century, and then we got to where we are today, whereas you have like mostly an independent Ireland. So at this time, it was just a colony. So the fact that the guys talking to this woman have English accents marks them as English and probably soldiers, not necessarily, but they could be soldiers. So, and this is the conversation they're having. We get dialogue. Oh, I never did such a thing. Oh, but you did. Oh, but I didn't. Didn't she say that? Yes, I heard her. Oh, there's a fib. And so it's right after hearing this conversation, he looks around for a little while, but then like kind of right after this, he says, I knew my stay was useless. And then I allowed the 2 pennies to fall against the 6 pence in my pocket. And then he gives up and he doesn't buy anything. And then we get to the ending, right? So my reading of this, like I think Elizabeth was hinting at. Oh, one thing I want to mention here is that the girl in this scene talking to these 2 English guys is not Magnan's sister, right? I've seen some people get confused with that just because there's not names and it can be confusing. This is just the woman who works at the shop, right? At the stall, selling at the stuff at the bazaar. So my reading of this is that what he experiences there. So he has this idealized, like angelic vision of what like love is or whatever, right? In his feelings about Magnan's sister. And then when he's at the bazaar, I think what he sees is the reality that like how do people actually get together? Like how does a guy like him end up with somebody? Well, maybe it's more like this. It's this kind of 2 English guys flirting with this Irish woman in this closed bazaar in this kind of seedy location. And it's just not beautiful, right? It's not angelic. It's not. And I'm going to make another video, I guess, talking about the structure of Araby essay, but it's not a knight bringing a present for a maiden. It's not something like that. It's too real. It's too you can't idealize it, right? You look at it and you're like, oh, this sucks. Like, like this is appalling. Like, this is kind of like whatever. Like it's not beautiful in that same way, right? The idea of like, well, this is how people actually get together. So what I think we see is kind of the boy's loss of faith in believing in this like idealized vision of the girl, right? And I want to focus in the last sentence, a creature driven and derided by vanity, on the word vanity. What does that mean? It's like selfishness, self-centeredness, right? How's he being self-centered? Well, maybe he realizes that it was never really about the girl. That his deification, to borrow a word, his deification of the girl, it was never about her. It was about him, right? It allowed him to have this like flight of fancy where he could imagine himself this like enchanted knight trying to win a beautiful maiden or whatever. And then I think when he goes to Araby, I think the world it all comes crashing down, right? And it's like, no, this is what the world is really like. So now I think an interesting question is whether that's like a good thing or a bad thing. That realization, losing that faith. Because I think the story would suggest that it was a misplaced faith to have in the first place. That it was wrong. Like he was incorrect, basically. That it just wasn't true. The things he believed in weren't true. So like there's a disappointment. I think people mention that. I think people use the term disappointment for where he ends up, and I think that's correct. But like I don't know. Is it better to see the like sad truth, or is it better to believe a beautiful lie? All right, and I want to connect this back to gender as well, right? Because someone else mentioned this. Let me see if I can find it real. So yeah, thinking about gender here. This was from Kennedy, who said gender could play a role in this situation because men could be putting women in the spotlight, having all these expectations and making them seem like objects of perfection rather than a person with imperfections. So I think that that was a really good way of yeah, trying to figure out what's because this like specific sort of like objectification, right? Like I was saying before, it's not maybe the usual kinds, but I really like that, like an object of perfection. That's what he treats the girl as. I think that's right. He treats her as like some kind of like religious idol, you know, to pray to or something like that, rather than a person with imperfections. So I think that is so. If we're talking about the gender dynamic here, I think it's basically like how and you know I think this could happen with women too, right? Like women could easily like the way a guy looks and idealize them, you know, like that could also happen, right? But I think if we're talking historically, I think this is probably more associated with men, and especially at this time period, right, 1912 or whatever. I think even more so probably. But yeah, so basically, the real thing that I think the story's trying to criticize, because that's something I want us to be thinking about, is like, is the story trying to criticize things that the boy does, or does the story like approve of things the boy does? Is it trying to undermine sexist ideology, or does it perpetuate sexist ideology? So maybe the kind of like sexist ideology here is yeah, like the building up of the opposite sex, maybe usually women, but like building someone up like that as if they're a perfect thing, and it's because of the gender dynamic. Like I think someone else mentioned, like you know, if there wasn't like any kind of like sexual thing here, then this probably wouldn't be happening in the same way, you know. So I think that there is that maybe it's more about how men like think about women and how that's bad for them, you know, because ultimately it's bad for this boy. Like Magnan's sister isn't really affected negatively in any way, you know. Like maybe you could say that it's you know she's getting spied on by him and maybe she's affected badly that way. But like it's more him who has the problem here, right? It's not so much that he's harming Magnan's sister. It's more that like by having this idealized vision of like what women are, he like drives himself crazy, you know? He can't focus on his day-to-day life because of it. So maybe what the story's trying to criticize is this sort of I don't know, men having a picture of women as like angels or like perfect beings or like virtuous or you know not capable of the evils that men are capable of or something like that. Thinking about them as too like dainty or yeah, just like above everything because they're perfect, you know. So I think that maybe what the story's criticizing is that kind of mindset that maybe some men have or that a man could have, thinking of women as just like above it all, you know, and just creatures who aren't pulled down by the disgusting world that men have to inhabit, you know? And I think maybe that is kind of a dated, at least a little bit. It would have been more so back in history when, you know, women weren't allowed to participate in a lot of stuff, didn't have the same kinds of jobs. You didn't have women, you know, like digging ditches as much or, you know, whatever, doing like manual labor in that kind of way. So, you know, what it is, maybe it's a critique of viewing women in terms of like purity, you know, in that kind of, yeah, maybe it's that like associating like purity with women in that way is kind of like something the story's trying to criticize. All right. Well, I've talked enough, but I guess so. If we were trying to write about this, I would be focusing on like what is that message about gender? What is the story trying to show us about like idealizing the other gender and like the losing faith? Because I think ultimately in the story, the boy losing faith in this is a good thing. Because I think it would say that this belief in like feminine purity is a bad thing, right? So the story shows us the boy losing faith in that and realizing that's bullshit. So in that way, to me at least, I think the story has kind of a positive message, you know, where it's trying to show us like that this should not be believed in because it's just not realistic. All right, well, I'll end here. Good work on the discussions. Really enjoyed that. I'm gonna try to keep doing this referencing specific people because I really appreciate a lot of your insights. Okay, see you later.